Hello. Oh boy, here we go. All right. First off, if everyone could please silence your cell phones. I don't know if you're allowed to record this, so I'm sorry. I saw the cell phones go up. Yes, other than that, hello, and welcome to our panel discussion. Houston, we have a planet, the spherical terrain of Kerbal Space Program 2. All right, so first off, I'm gonna introduce everyone on our panel here. Right to my left, we have Son Campbell, who is our principal environment artist. Next, we have Mike Azzinaro, who is our software engineer 2, specializing in graphics. Then Brandon Orden, who's our senior environment artist. And finally, John Cioletti, who is our tech artist, senior tech artist. And I'm Kristina Ness. I'm the art director. All right, so first, audience participation. Can I get a show of hands of who has played Kerbal Space Program? Oh, awesome, excellent. Okay, wait, keep your hands up. Raise your hands if you just know what Kerbal Space Program is. Okay, excellent, perfect, thank you. All right, so for those of you folks with your hands down, I'd just like to play our early access gameplay trailer so you can get an idea of what Kerbal Space Program is all about. All right, that's Kerbal Space Program 2. It is a realistic spaceflight simulator where players can build, launch, and crash custom vehicles with the goal of exploring the universe alongside the strange and wacky Kerbals who run the space program. And bottom left corner are the little green men themselves. Kerbal Space Program 2 is a sequel to the critically acclaimed and beloved Kerbal Space Program 1, and this new installment is dedicated to pushing the depiction of real-world scientific concepts in an engaging and approachable way. Before we get too deep into panel land, there is some quick basic terminology I'd like to establish here, because I think you're gonna hear it pop up and get thrown around a lot during our talk. So can I get one last show of hands? Who here knows what celestial body means or describes? Okay, I love an intelligent audience, excellent. So while it's tempting for us to use the word planet to describe celestial bodies, our Kerbolar system, where the game takes place, also contains a parent star, a gas giant, dwarf planets, moons. So you're gonna hear us say CB a lot, and that's what it means. So let's just get into it. Guys, hi, welcome.
Hi.
I'm kind of curious, just broad strokes, what were the biggest challenges you had when making tools for spherical planets?
Yeah, I can start on that. Kind of just another point of reference, similar to the CB terminology, another kind of reference term, another kind of term that we were going to throw around a lot in this talk, and if it's, the one thing you'll learn today is the difference between local space and scaled space. We're going to say it a lot. So just kind of talk about that really quick. Scaled space is the version of the planet you're going to be seeing when you're far away. It's usually like a lower resolution version of the planet that's meant to be seen, again, from far away. Whereas the local space planet or the local space terrain is what you see when you're on the ground. It's the simulated terrain that you actually walk on and crash into. So with that in mind, when we're talking about challenges when simulating terrain on the scale that we are, especially if it's on top of it being spherical, the main thing that starts out is like all default Unity tools and most game making tools and terrain making tools all assume you're making a game on a flat horizon. And it also makes the assumption that y, your coordinate y is always up. And on a spherical planet, that isn't always the case. And this affects everything between trying to place objects in a scene or trying to move around a scene. And again, like any kind of conventional terrain kind of making software is not really applicable. So we've had to make it our own in order to overcome this challenge here.
Yeah, on the more technical side of that, definitely shape and scale are the two biggest issues. So like Brendan mentioned, shape, we tried a couple assets from the asset store during the process of development, and most of those, even outside just engine-specific built-in stuff, are also either designed for very small spherical planets, or they're designed for just very flat, large terrains. So you'll hear we'll be bringing up floating point and floating point precision during this talk, and that's like the biggest hurdle for almost anything related to anything of this scale. So like Kerbin in the image is around 600,000 in-game Unity units, and that's not an exaggeration. There's no like faking there. It's literally that far away. So whenever it comes to do anything, lighting, shadows, shading, clouds, water, you name it on the planet, we have to factor that into it.
And because we're dealing with multiple views in the game, when the environment team is demanding tools, requesting tools from the graphics team, they have to solve for not just one view like most games. They have to solve for, make sure it looks good when you're on the ground and when you're in space. So any issues or tools requests like lighting, shadows, atmospheric scatter, they have to solve for both perspective and make sure the transitions are working well.
Yeah, and I think the last thing to add on to that is that this, sorry, I should talk more in the mic here. This process of making spherical terrains is not often done in a lot of games, and there's no real standard for it. We looked at a lot of examples of previous other games like No Man's Sky, Star Citizen, and like even Outer Wilds is a planet that all has a lot of spherical terrain as well. And each of them has a different kind of problem space and a different kind of game they're trying to make. And because we are building this game like on top of the framework of KSP1, and we have this framework of scaled space and local space, again, our solution had to be unique, and we couldn't just like, oh, this set works and we could just use that. So yeah, we've had to adapt to that.
Yeah, Mike, you mentioned earlier the sheer size of Kerbin. I believe Kerbin has about like a 600-kilometer radius. Like, for you guys, what were the art challenges that you had to solve when making a planet and celestial bodies of such great scale?
Yeah, so I don't know if okay, no, we're good. So yeah, floating point is definitely the biggest one. So if you look in the bottom left and the top left pictures we have up there, when we're talking about Unity, and if we were to literally just put the planet at say 0, 0, 0, and then be on the surface of Kerbin, you get artifacts like the bottom left. So that's floating point precision. Basically, to describe it for those that are not as technically known on the graphic side, probably for that, floating point is how computers represent numbers. And basically, to represent a full range of very high precision numbers, you can either have a very big whole number or a very big decimal. And then anywhere in between, you get good numbers. But once you go too far to one end, so in our case, really big whole numbers, you lose a lot of precision. So that impacts everything in our game. So like I was saying, in the default Unity scene, if you were to just drag an object that far, you'll get, that's not like a stylized sphere or a mesh. That's just a regular sphere. The same with the cube, same with the rock. We get artifacts like that. And same on the top left, we get the stair-stepping of the terrain. That was an issue we had to solve on the local space planet, where the height map resolution, when you expand it out on the sphere and project it, the resolution just isn't high enough to create a proper high-resolution planet, at least initially.
Yeah, so for that height map there, it's using a height map of 16-bit depth precision. So if you don't know what that is, like essentially a height map determined, like to get like a smooth height map, we use 16-bit precision images, which have 0 to about a little over 65,000 ranges of black to white colors. And even that extreme range is not enough to like, at the scale that we're building these planets, to create smooth hills. So we would find these stair steps in our terrain.
Yeah, so in order to solve that, we had to implement our own sort of, not a new graphics taking like bilinear filtering and Gaussian blur and those type of blending operations between nearby vertices so we can share information without needing to take our height map and then build it to like an 8K height map or like a 16 by 16K height map for each planet. So that allowed us to maintain the performance of not having insanely large textures, but also resolve some of that stair stepping.
The art team wanted 16K.
Another challenge here is looking at what textures look like when they're height blended at a high altitude. So you see there's two images there in the middle for one that says height blend at the top and alpha blend at the bottom. So we found that, when you mix two ground textures together, typically height blending them together is a way to go because you get a lot of cool interactions between materials that have different height maps, and so you see they kind of intermix depending, like you'll have like snow that sits on top of rock or grass that sits on top of dirt and it looks natural. And it looks good when you're up close, but as soon as we started flying anywhere between 50 to 100 meters into the air, we immediately started to see like tiling artifacts, or like you could see like the repetition of the height map interactions between two materials pretty readily, and it was very distracting. So what we did to solve this problem was the artist requested a kind of switch so that we can, at a certain altitude above the surface of the terrain, we can say go from height blending, render the terrain with height blending, and instead render it with alpha blending, which instead of seeing the two materials interact together by height blending, you would instead do a smooth blend, which kind of solves two problems. One, it helps the tiling artifacts kind of go away, and it, again, gives us control of when that occurs at a certain altitude. But it also, another thing we're going to be touching on a lot is one of our biggest goals was to help make the transition between when you're going from the ground all the way to space. We want to make that feel as seamless and as cohesive as possible. So that was another thing where it helped.
Yeah, so let's get into kind of what our current art pipeline looks like. So when you're starting to create Celestial Body for KSP2, what was the first couple steps?
Yeah, right. So the first steps involve our design team and Nate Simpson, our creative director. The team figures out the concept for a planet and what we like to call the landing puzzle for the planet. And landing puzzle is kind of our local term for essentially the player experience or what we want the player to kind of learn and take away by interacting with a certain CB or celestial body. I use the Mun as an example here, so you see a screenshot of the Mun on the top right. Its landing puzzle is all about teaching the player to land on a part of the planet based on its appearance, based on the appearance of the scaled space asset. So like looking at the planet, I'm not sure how well it's visible on the slide there, but like you can see that there's kind of two big coloration areas of the Mun. There's like the darker, the mare of the Mun, and then there's the cratery kind of lighter gray area of the Mun. And so from a glance, you may be able to tell that like the dark gray spots are a lot smoother, a lot more like flatter, whereas the cratery areas are a lot more mountainous and rougher, have more slopes. So the player is kind of like to intuit like, oh, maybe I can land in the areas where it's smoother, and that will give me an easier time when I'm trying to land on this planet. And it's kind of meant to be a very gentle, because it's the first celestial body that are going to be landing that's outside of Kerbin. It's kind of like the first baby steps of kind of teaching the player landing somewhere easy based on, and picking a landing spot that's intentional. And kind of talking more about like the process of creating a planet, if we're carrying over a planet from KSP1, what we want to do is we aim to preserve what's cool about the first planet, or the KSP1 planet, and essentially and it by looking at its real world analogs. So like, we preserve the cool stuff, like there's this picture on there of the mole hole. It's a whole thing. It's basically a graphical glitch from the KSP1 on Moho that was.
We purposely had to make a graphical glitch.
But yeah, it's like things like that from the first game that players love, we want to preserve. When we're doing this next pass on these planets, like again, we're looking at the real world analogs to again try to bring a lot more realism and fidelity in terms of its detail to its surface. So for the the other planets in that image there, like Moho's analog is Mercury, so we looked at a lot of Mercury. For ELU, on the bottom left, we looked at Pluto. On the top left is my very messy reference sheet for Eve, which its analog is Venus. So there's a lot of really cool reference for that, of photos of Venus, along with like any geography that is similar to that kind of terrain type.
Yeah, in the reference picture, we make sure that we get good reference from like scale space to mid-level and all the way to the ground of other planets. And because we're inheriting KSP-1 planets, for KSP-2, you might wonder if we ever thought about going through the route of like a random planet generator. And while it sounds like it'd be easy for us artists to just have sliders, and hit the easy button, unfortunately, so inheriting KSP-1 lore, we went to the path of being handcrafted. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so moving right along, we talked a little bit earlier about scaled and local space. Can you all explain like the differences in scaled and local space and why it's important to preserve those two reads in KSP2?
Yeah, so I can talk about that. The scaled versus local space transition that you see here was inherited by KSP1. So the biggest level of detail that you see from far away is our scaled space mesh, which is a traditionally modeled mesh that you saw from the previous concepts. The artists take a look there and get as much of the big picture detail that they can. And then as you approach the planet, the local space dithers in. And as you can see this image, it's actually coming out. But from a far distance, you get a lot of almost like low-level quad generation. And as you move closer and closer, we tessellate the mesh more and more to get a higher level of fidelity in the terrain. So also in this space is where all the physics quads are generated. We wanted a high level of detail for physics quads because when you interact with the terrain, land a vessel, and leave, we wanted it to mirror the actual look of the terrain as close as we could. And things like our ocean also follow this sort of tessellation method where at a far distance, the ocean is a very low level resolution, and as you get closer and closer, it becomes very high in detail.
Yeah, and to, I guess, elaborate a little more, you might be asking yourself, like, in the first step of the art pipeline, they mentioned they do the scale space first and then local space, when you would think it might be more intuitive to make the local space planet and then just generate the scaled one from it. But just because of the way we wanted to design the landing, it needs to be a good read from the start. And the way we did the texturing for the local space planet just pulls straight from the scaled space generated textures. So when they come up with a really good read for that scaled space look, we can then take those textures, apply them to the procedural texturing and procedural tessellation system of the local space, and that gives us a pretty accurate one-to-one matching of whatever it looks like in scaled space is what it's going to look like when you're close to the ground.
And then with that too, it's a bit like back and forth because you design the scaled space to make the local space, but then if there are tools for things that we'll get into that do tessellate the ground very significantly, it then can be baked back up to the scaled space to help the scaled space read.
Yeah, Azzinaro. Speaking of that GIF in the top right corner, how are we simulating the terrain in local space?
Yeah, so John mentioned a little bit about it. We use a system we call PQS, which is admittedly not new technology. It was used in KSP1, and we took it, refined it, upgraded it, and optimized it for KSP2. So it's much, I'd say, less of a terrain system than it is just a procedural LOD system. Obviously, for performance reasons, you want bigger triangles. I think it was actually a good talk yesterday about why you do not want small triangles in the distance. So we want bigger triangles further away, smaller triangles up close, because we really want to create as immersive, as high definition, as high quality a local space read as we can. Like the bottom right image, like we want that and more. We want it to feel like any third-person, first-person AAA game you could go play when you're on the local space. And then we want to maintain that all the way up as you go up higher in the planet. So PQS is what we used, and then we used a procedural texturing system on it that I believe we go into shortly after this, or we'll talk in more detail about, that allows the artists to put their touch on this new terrain system.
Yeah, so for the artists, what was the process you all went through to get spherical, scaled, and local space terrain, both views in Unity?
So when we're creating our celestial bodies, we think of 3 tiers. We have scale space, large, and small. And with scale space, we actually create this in Substance Painter. We found that Substance Painter has very non-destructive workflow, and you have the ability to see the displacement of height map in real time. So you get a good idea of what our continents would look like in our game. We're using masks to create these height maps, and we can extract those masking into what's called our biomask. We have 4 biomes per planet. So for Kerbal, for example, we have grasslands, sand, snow, and mountains. And these biomass tell us where the details go, where the large scale detail goes, our small scale textures, and where our scatter system are applied. And during this phase, we also have, we quickly apply atmosphere and clouds just to, if the celestial body has atmosphere, just to gauge how it looks and get the feel. And at each level we'll talk about, we have fade ranges. So we have altitude sliders to say when we want the scale space to fade off. And we also have opacity on each end of like the ground and space. And with our terrain, we've also, the controls are like albedo and normal and gloss. And in scale space, you'll slightly see scale space in the local space just to help the transition that's important to our game.
Yeah, and to add to that, scaled space and creating that mesh and painter and really getting that really worked out and fleshed out, it's important because it's usually the first step in like kind of establishing, kind of like to say, the personality of what the planet will look like. Like when we talk with leads in design, we look at the planet and we kind of decide, oh, okay, does this kind of meet design's needs for the landing puzzle? Does the distribution of biomes feel right? Does the colors feel like the mood of the planet that we want? What I like to say, like, and it informs so much about all the work we'll be doing forward, because we're going to be matching so much of our content on the local space work to match the scaled space. So like kind of what I like to say is, as a kind of a visual rule for like scaled to local space is, when you're looking at something from scaled space, from far away in space, the phrase is, what you see is what you get, right? So like if you see a green spot on the planet from scaled space, and you look at that and there's like a green spot and there's a crater there you can see from scaled space, the ideal is you look at that spot and go, I want to land on that green spot, and you fly all the way down and you go all the way down to the ground, and you can see that when you get to the ground, it is indeed green and there is a crater there. So we want to try to, like, again, a big part of our game is, again, like trying to make that transition as smooth as possible and that things match.
And in early phase of KSP2, we actually created the planets sculpting using ZBrush, but it was a way too destructive of a process, because when we presented to our creative director and its design, they want to change something. It's a lot of work in ZBrush, so that's one reason why we switched to Painter.
And the last thing is that when we do the scaled space too, when we get to a point where we feel content with it and we're all feeling good about it, and then typically what me and Sung do is, like, even after we're done with the scaled space and we do move on to local space work, we still often have to go back to the scaled space because we find that, oh, that color green is way too much when you're on the ground. And so it's a constant back and forth process going between looking at the ground, flying up into space and evaluating it, and looking back and forth between those two views, again, all in the service of good transitions and seamless viewing of the planet.
Yeah, Sung, earlier when you were talking about scaled space, you mentioned that transition into like the large and medium textures. What's the goal of like this view of the planet or the celestial body?
This is the large scale read, and after we export height map for the scale space, and then we can add details in. We can add height maps on top of that, and I think Brendan can talk about all the normal details here.
Right, yeah, right, ooh, sorry. Yeah, so if you look at those screenshots you see on the screen there, you can kind of see, like, if you compare the bottom left screenshot, that's kind of what like the terrain looks like without any kind of large scale normal map, large scale height map. And on the right side, you'll see it with like a large scale normal and a large scale height map. And these, I've been calling it a large scale texture. They are made in World Creator. There are basically these 1 to 3 kilometer big terrain textures that tile. And the idea with these is that each biome, like Sung was mentioning, Kerbal has 4 biomes. Each one of those biomes has, each biome on a planet throughout the game has one large-scale texture. And that texture is meant to represent the kind of signature geological feature of that biome. You see some this is the mountain biome, so you're gonna see mountains. For like a desert, you may see like, the large-scale texture may resemble something like big, giant sand dunes, or for like a grassland biome, it might be rolling hills or flowing like fluvial erosion patterns. Or like for the Mun, like one of its biomes might be a bunch of craters as for one of its biomes. Yeah, and the reason why we chose World Creator as our kind of method of choice for generating these large-scale textures was mainly out of the box. World Creator allows you to create tiling height maps. Which again, like we need the tiling again to wrap around the planet because it's so much area. But also like, because we tile it, we have the flexibility of messing with the scale of the tiling rate and to get the feel of what we want the terrain to be like when you're on the ground.
And initially at the large scale level, we also, currently what you see is just the normal detail. But at first, we also had albedo information. We also had glass information as well. But we found that we can strip away the albedo and glass, and all of the albedo information you see here is from small scale. It was just less textures and just less work for us artists.
Yeah, let's talk about those small textures once you get up close. Like, when would you interact with this level of scale?
Right. So at scale space, when you're heading down towards the ground, is when you start seeing those small scale textures, and there are 4 sets of textures per biome. We found that 4 provided good enough texture diversity to get the look and feel we wanted. Us artists we wanted more, but the programmers were like, no. Perf reasons, understandable.
We understand.
Yeah, and on the bottoms, you can kind of see like our thought process of how we apply small scale textures. You can see ones like we just start with grass. This is the mountain biome. Then we added rocks. Then we added dirt and snow caps, and at the end you can see scatter. And with small scale textures, we had these procedural tools, and in terms of height, slope, peak, and weights.
Yeah, so since if you're for those of you at home keeping count, we have 4 biomes, and then each of those biomes has 4 textures in it. And well, no, not just 4. It has the large scale, the mid scale, and 4 small textures in it as well. So it's a very delicate balance in order to give the artist the fidelity to create really beautiful, like I said, these immersive local reads that when you're on a planet, it feels like any other third-person game. But then we always have to calculate the balance out of that with.
Yeah, and each texture set is like albedo, normal, glass, height, AO. So times.
Yeah, so not just one of those. Yeah, multiply
right,
those
so
by 5, and then you'll understand why it's such a planetary effort to texture the entire planet. But yeah, so we messed around with a lot of procedural texturing that enabled us to not, like I mentioned earlier, have to deal with massively large texture files and have texture reused to allow us to provide detail over the biomes as necessary.
Yeah, so this panel is obviously a mix of artists and engineers and tech artists. What was the relationship between like the graphics programming team and the art team? Oh,
sorry, yeah. I have one more note about small scale textures that's kind of fun to know about. So we also implement this technique for looking at small scale textures as a way of coming to help mitigate tiling. The technique is called distance resampling, and the whole idea behind that is when you see things, when you have a Kerbal on scale on the ground, let's assume like the UV scale of textures, the small scale textures around the Kerbal is like 1. What we do is that we set the UV scale of the small scale textures to be different sizes depending on what altitude you are above the ground. So for example, after you're about, so if you're on the ground, the UV scale is 1, let's say about either in the distance, 50 meters or like 100 meters in the air, we may set the UV scale for the small scale textures to be something more like 0.8 or 0.5. So it has the kind of effect of like making the textures bigger. And we have at least 4 different scales of this as you go up into space. And what this does is, if we didn't have this, what happens is like the texture scale just stays at 1 constantly as you go high into the air, it makes tiling a lot more visible. But because like the tiling rate kind of changes and lerps smoothly between one UV scale to another as you're going up, it has the effect of kind of mitigating that tiling. But also when those small scale textures are kind of stretched enough, it ends up creating this kind of interesting, you get this interesting kind of mid-level texture. It kind of gives the terrain more of like a macro kind of texture, which again, just ends up creating a good look.
Yeah, just to reinforce that, the resampling was necessary to add the blending between it, because like, if we did that just based purely on your altitude and not the distance, as you moved up, like you would see the textures of the whole world move below you with this. So we had to like implement that distance blending as well in order to account for both as you're close, you'll see small textures, and as you're far, you'll see the wide UVs. And it massively helps with tiling too, and avoids us having to use expensive anti-tiling techniques.
So you can tell how closely these artists and engineers work together. Yeah, if you guys could just expand on that relationship that you guys had in the studio as you developed these celestial bodies and the tools.
Yeah, for one, be nice to your graphics team, because they're the ones that are providing us artists to make cool stuff. And second is make sure when you're developing tools the artist wants, make sure you're showing good examples of what you want. So on the far right image, you get a kind of glimpse of us artist workflow. We actually mocked up a UI of how we want our terrain shader to work, and be very specific of how you want the graphics programmers to implement the tools you want. In terms of like order, the way you want it, the color scheme, because the terrain shader has hundreds of settings, it was important for us artists to quickly go to the section we wanted. So we made sure everything was colorized. Another example is we have tons of biomes, and we wanted the ability just to work on one biome, because we found that we constantly were accidentally touching textures that was in a different biome. So having a setting that says, hey, make this biome exclusive was very important. The sliders, any spec of details for the terrain textures specs you want. I would say for artists, communicate and show real examples to your graphics team to get the tools you want.
Yeah, and then on the flip side of that, you obviously have the other end where it's like, as graphics programmers or just software engineers in general, sometimes when artists come to you and they're like, hey, we need a tool that allows us to do this, you're like, okay. And then you just take all the variables that you have and you just make them public in Unity, and it's just like, all right, go wild. You can literally touch everything, go for it. And then they're like, all right, I moved this and it turned black and it exploded or flipped everything inside out. And it's like, okay. So we actually need to put some thought into hand making the tools and polishing them up. It is not wasted work, and it makes their lives much easier. It cuts back on the throwing back. Like, we're all the same team here, so it's not like throwing over the fence, but it still can cause like hey, I was trying to make this look, and I couldn't get it to work. Oh, I'll tell them, move this slider like this, but when it's labeled properly, executed, and the mockups did a massive help for eliminating that between us. So I can just say, oh, okay, this is what you want. I'll get this for you, and it becomes a question of, do you need this exposed, rather than I'm just going to expose you everything. And then
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback off the point of having a good reference point or mock-up of like how to create tools, a lot of thing we did is we looked at a lot of existing like external tools to like help inform what our controls look like. So for example, like for the way we wanted procedural texturing to work on our small scale textures, we looked a lot at World Creator because we really enjoyed, like me and Sung really enjoyed using those controls to like make masks or to create like snow tops on mountains, that kind of thing. And so we essentially looked at a lot of those controls and used those as the model for the mock-ups for how we wanted procedural texturing to work in our game. Another example of that is I think we use Quixel Mixer as like our reference point for how we want the controls for small scale textures for blending. There we have like, yeah, it's a good practice just to, because again, it keeps everyone on the same page when you're looking at the same thing and it's doing the same function that we're all looking at, and it's a very good concrete example, helps communication very much.
Yeah, and then to piggyback also on the topic of communication, it's also very important just because sometimes the artists will ask like, hey, they'll see with reference tools like, hey, we could do this in this tool, like this changes this, can you give us that functionality? And then we unfortunately have to have the unfortunate conversation of, no, we can't actually do that, that's not possible. Or sometimes, yeah, but this is how much work it'll take. Or, yeah, we could actually do that, it'll be pretty trivial. So you really gotta knowing what they're after, and then also you gotta keep performance in your head as an engineer. And unfortunately, you do have to give them the bad news sometimes that, no, you cannot have that toy, and I'm sorry.
They're like our parents. We're like, we want more sugar. But they're like, no, we can't. It's perf.
Okay.
All right, John, I'm throwing this question directly at you. Given that we have to light an entire Kerbaler system, what were the considerations you have to make when designing a system like that?
Yeah, first things for considering lighting that I first thought were, let's start with the star. We want a big source light, the biggest ball of plasma in the sky. We'll start with Kerbal. So intuitively, it's like, oh yeah, directional light, and then it follows you around as you go around the universe. As you get further away, it attenuates. And my first thought was, oh, we're in like a dynamic sim. Why not have this sort of like tied to a function where it's very hard-coded distances, like lighting fall off is like, more realistic in a way. But as I learned, once the artists had it in their hands, they're like, oh, it's like way too bright by Moho, way too dark, far away at Elu. It's like, can we get away from this function and have like more artist-tunable functions? So instead, we opted out for just a fall-off curve and a distance value. So it's like very simple, but it works as you go through the universe. It gets dimmer. That's great. Next step is when you get closer to, no, you can say right.
Oh, here.
Yeah. When you get closer, we'll say, like, because in this example, it's Kerbin, the Mun and Minmus. There's a bunch of different celestial bodies with different terrains, lighting parameters. And again, my first thought was like, oh, it's like a function, everything has different fall-offs. And again, the artist wanted more tunable control over the specific celestial bodies. Like, so the lighting that was on Kerbin, when it was set to Mun, since the Mun is more like lighter colors, it was like feeling very blown out, very hard to play, essentially. So a lot of back and forth with me and the artists on lighting to figure out what is the best way to balance that level of like dynamic lighting that feels realistic while also having like an intuitive player-facing gameplay appeasing sort of lighting scenario. So like having different overrides per planet. So like while they do have the fall off still, the artist can opt in or out of an override. So as you leave Kerbin and enter like Mun's SOI, I have those values of like maybe Kerbin has like 100% of Kerbal light, and that looks good for it. But as you get into like Mun's SOI and load in like the Mun terrain and all of its detail, it drops down to like 65 because that feels more of like the moon from reference footage that we've seen.
And SOI is sphere of influence.
The sphere of influence is the physics bubble, essentially, that when your vessel enters, it then utilizes like that planet's gravity. It's like it's catched.
It's attracted to the center of the spinning celestial body.
Mm-hmm. We have so many three-letter acronyms in our game.
Yeah, we do. I'm sorry.
The game itself.
The game itself is an acronym.
So yeah, as like I mentioned, we have a lot of additional lightings. Besides directional lighting, there's bounce lighting and like a planet shine. So a tool we implemented was spherical harmonics to help with the diffuse lighting on our planets. So as Joule rises in the sky while you're on Lathe, there's more green affecting the terrain. Something we had to do for our game was modify how we sampled the spherical harmonics, because Unity's native L2 had some backbleeding issues when the intensity was too high, because the artist really wanted to push like the really green at night, because it's like we want to really sell that emotional feel. So that was definitely a consideration we had to take on. We also looked into how to do occlusion and eclipses. So if Joule is in the sky, but you're orbiting Lathe and Lathe coverage tool, you don't want any of that green light. So we utilize just some very simple like circular math and sorting to figure out when things were fully occluded, to figure out like a percentage visibility to allow for like that color to attenuate. Yes. And finally, the last bit of lighting that we looked into was global illumination and how we could have a sort of quick and low-cost bounce light at all times. Luckily, since the scaled space is always there, we can actually render it to a cube map where the camera is. You'll see that in the left image on like the top left at the KSC. You'll see like the green ground of Kerbal and the blue sky. This cube map is always generated as our way of getting like a real-time bounce light. And then because Unity is Y-up, but our game is not, we had to also factor in the orientation of the transform matrix into our rendering to then sample that. So what we had to do was modify some of the back end and modify Unity's standard shader to get the results that we wanted. What we do for our planets, all of our scenery is have the custom GI pass go through and sample this cube map at different MIP levels. So for like diffuse lighting, it'll be a lower MIP, so it kind of blurs it out to get a better look of like bounce light. But for something specular like the ocean, it's higher, so you actually get a more like one-to-one type of reflection look. Since we are in the built-in render pipeline as of early access launch, we didn't have access to HDRP sort of like scripted render pipeline stuff. And as you'll see on the right side of the right image it's very similar to Unity's lighting window, but expanded to include all of our additional properties for artist tuning, so like cube map intensity and like their MIP levels and how we sample them.
Awesome, yeah. So going forward, where do you guys want to take and develop these tools throughout early access?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about it earlier when I was talking about the PQS and how it was a system we used in Kerbal 1, and we did take it, optimized it, multi-threaded it, threw it behind compute shaders as much as we could, but we sort of hit the limit for at least artistic capacity with it. So we're investigating a new terrain system, or I guess terrain meshing LOD system that'll allow us to get a better breakup of those LODs, and it'll allow us to split the mesh up into more manageable chunks, because we were talking about the amount of textures we need for the single shader. If we split the mesh up into multiple shaders, it'll allow us to give the artists more toys to play with, so they can make even more interesting planets, like from higher numbers of biomes than 4. But
What?
yeah, I know, crazy. We can do that for you.
Oh my
It's
God.
super exciting for us artists. I think with any project, you always find yourself limited with the tools and the engine you're using. And we've already got a preview of what's possible, so it's very exciting for us.
Yeah, I'm super pumped. Pun intended, I feel it will unlock a whole new world of possibility of like a level of detail that we can achieve, and just like getting good, not only great detail, but just making it seamless, like again, from local space, scaled space, any distance.
Yeah, and as we investigate things like HDRP more and more to get the lighting that we really want with this game, to get that level of like stylized realism we're looking for, I'm really excited to like have that back and forth with the artists to see like just what we can get at like physically based cameras, all the post-processing it offers. It's gonna be a fun journey.
Definitely is. And so thank you all for listening to our chat here about spherical celestial bodies. Kerbal Space Program 2 is currently in early access and playable via Steam, Epic Games Store, and our private division web store online. We just released patch 1 last week. The patch notes contain like over 250 bug fixes, so check it out. It's nuts. We've also got a slew of new features planned throughout early access, such as science mode, which will introduce a campaign, colonies, interstellar travel, and multiplayer as we lead up to 1.0. If you're interested in checking it out before going home, head down to the expo hall. Thank you to Unity for inviting us here for the sponsored session, and also for hosting a demo station down in the expo hall. You can play that first patch of our game right now. As a thank you all for sitting through this talk, I've got some never-before-seen images on this slide of a brand new Kerbal Space Program 2 celestial body that does not exist in Kerbal Space Program 1. We'll be introducing it during that interstellar update. Say hi to Gerdama. I think we've shown this off a little bit in our developer diaries, but Gerdama is a high-pressure, heavily cratered celestial body from the Deb system. It has oceans of water, 2 rings, and not 1, but 2 moons. So can't you wait to explore it? All right. Thank you all. I think we've got some time here, maybe 15 more minutes for questions. If anyone has a question, I believe we've got 2 different mics. We'll probably bounce between them. Again, thank you so much to Unity, as well as our Unity engineers that Unity basically rented out to us. Skip Petty and Patrick DeVarney, they're amazing. They've been working very, very closely with this team to get us optimized and performant.
Evaluations.
Hi.
Evaluations?
Oh, don't forget to fill out your evaluations. Everyone leaving, fill out your evaluations
want us
for
back.
this talk. Thank you. All right, let's start it off right here.
Hi.
Hi,
Hi.
The talks was very inspiring.
thank you.
And I want to ask you, what about coordinate system and scaling in the space? Because we have the same problem on the terrain, because we have the floating point same problem.
Yeah, so I can answer that. To just repeat it, the question was about coordinate systems and scaling on terrain. So that's one of the things actually in the new terrain system that we're looking into. We're planning on using the data structure S2, which is I think something that was either developed by Google Maps or Amazon and used to map the real world down to a precision of I think 1 centimeter square. So for our new coordinate system, or for the new terrain system that we'll be using, we're going to be using that in order to sample our locations on the various height maps. So I believe that's like, it's laid out in a recursive fashion. So like when you know one level of detail, you know the adjacent areas in level of detail, and the lookup's extremely fast on it. It's lighter on storage than normal Cartesian coordinates or polar. And yeah, so, but at the current time, we're not using that. I believe we're just using Cartesian coordinates with double precision. But yeah, so that's, if you want the future solution, that's probably the one, the S2. But for the current time, we're just using double precision Cartesian.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Yeah, you're good. It's all at this front mic. Don't worry about it.
There's a mic behind me. Hello, I love to
Hi.
talk. I had a question pertaining to a certain slide a while back. If you could flip, it was a slide that had like the 4 biomes, and they were encoded into like RGBA.
Oh yeah, let me find that. Hang on. This guy?
Yes, that's the one. Maybe it's just me being stupid and not understanding. But so you have in the channels grassland, sand, snow, mountains. How do you represent water texture? Is that done separately somehow?
So yeah, that's the sand is where the water would go.
Oh,
Yeah.
I guess that, sure.
And so there's a lot of stuff we didn't even touch, like how our water system works. But we do have like since we have terrain and our water, we have another like mesh just for water. Yeah. And in scale space, we actually just paint on water, because when in scale space, you're just seeing a single mesh, right? So yeah, it's just painted on in terms of scale space.
Okay, yeah, that does answer my question.
Yeah, and there's another point to that too. Like when we're authoring the scaled space mesh, like in Painter, we can usually dictate like, okay, at a certain height value, but anywhere below that, we can just know that's going to be water. So that way, like we can like deserts definitely generally, or the sand where is definitely generally where it correlates like where water could go, but like the scaled space height map of Kerbin, like anywhere it's below a certain height threshold, we can assume it's going to be water, just because like if the water is a perfect sphere and like the scaled space mesh is, going up and down, up and down, up and down, and if it's like below a certain height, the water will be above it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Okay, thank you.
Good question.
Continuing with the water, at local space, how did you manage to keep the shorelines consistent as you go through the LOD changes?
Yeah. So how did you keep the coastlines consistent between scaled and local space?
Not in scaled and local, but
Just
In local, through LOD changes, as you get closer to the space, the resolution changes, and so does the height of the water mesh, and the terrain will not consistently match.
Yeah, we've done a little bit of work on that just because it's like sort of, I think you would know this, that it's like an inherent problem of like when you get a lower resolution, the triangle is going to be different from the LOD and it's going to be visually different. So one thing I think we did, we texture underneath it as you go up the same color that it would be. So even though the LOD changes, where on the triangle that it would be colored is actually the color it's supposed to be. But it's not a problem we have fully solved because you could even see in the game if you like fly straight up, there will be some very specific spots that unfortunately you'll see that tessellation happen. And there's probably alternative solutions that we could look into for it, but at the moment it was mainly just the blending of that water texture and yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We should repeat the questions.
Oh yeah.
Hey, my question is, I'm wondering the extent to which you guys have used geospatial data in your workflows. I mean, obviously, the hyper-realism of some of those scenes is really beautiful, but to the extent that you're using digital elevation model data, or even just for 2D texturing, some of the, instead of writing graphics shaders, to use the actual 2D textures from Mother Nature. I just wonder if there's any use of that, given the focus on realism.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so early in the project, we've experimented a bit with like using like satellite, like height map data to help, try to create patches of terrain. But it always kept coming back to how do we tile this across the planet? How do we do this in a way that scales to planet scale, right? So we found that like we could like, again, get little patches that looked good, but like in the end, we ended up going through the workflow of using World Creator, and more going the procedural route rather than like using a lot of real life captured data. But I'd say with our scaled space workflow, sometimes we integrate a little bit of like that satellite data, like images from space that like can add a lot of like cool texture or kind of material to like a scaled space view of a planet. But for the local space, I don't think we use that much.
Yeah, it was also, there's a double-edged sword using real-life source because while it does look good, it is hard to extract masking that we need for a game, right? So like we could have used tons of texture from the moon, but we need the height data and the masking data to make our biome mask. So it would have been a lot of hand-painted work that was. We didn't want to do all that. It was
Work smart, not hard.
Work smart, exactly.
Yeah, thank you.
I was just wondering, because it sounds like pretty much everything you're doing is just doing tons and tons and tons of distance checks. So is there a way that you either preemptively avoided just the expense of doing tons of distance checks all at once, or that you mitigated the effects of doing that?
Not really. Just the question was, we're doing distance resampling, and in a game like this, we're checking how far we are from something a lot of the time. And the reality is, it's actually surprisingly not that intensive. So like the terrain shader, like I said, we do the distance resampling, but that's like one shader pass, and so it has the information at the start to like whatever pixel, actually depth textures. So the depth texture will give you a nice, all that information already, how far you are from where you're at. And since that's the way we render the planet, we generate the geometry for it first and then do the texturing. So since we already have the geometry information, we can basically generate a depth map for the planet already in camera space. And then you don't need to actually do distance like checking like that. It's already built in. You could just sample the depth texture when you're doing the texture reads.
Yeah, because the planet shader itself is multipass, so we kind of anticipate the data that we'll need, so we like get it out of the way to then utilize it later.
Very cool.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So you mentioned having a multiplayer update. How are you balancing the dynamicism of the texture engine versus like what a person locally perceives and what gets replicated?
Ooh, I wish we had a multiplayer engineer up here. I can say that we've got a multiplayer team who's basically building multiplayer out concurrently all the way throughout, prior to now and up through early access to make sure that we're solving these answers along the way as features go in.
Verifying like any check-in, we check in, make sure it's like
Multiplayer
hey, how
approved.
will this work in multiplayer or no? Does this have any implications for multiplayer? It's like always questions we ask at every stage of the check-ins.
Yeah, I wish I could answer your question in more detail, but
No worries.
Eric Malota would love to be here and answer that for you.
I can at least talk a little bit about it,
Yeah.
which is for our visual systems, a lot of them are like observer focused. So we've designed those systems to be like, this current player will see these things, they'll be rendered this kind of way because it's their version of the game that they're seeing. Like they don't have to worry about what other players see. So in that regards, like your own computer just handles rendering. In terms of like physics and like the client itself, that'll be, I don't know how it's handled. It likely is like the host, and then from there it'll solve the issues that come up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, was there any support within the technology of this system for something that isn't a perfectly spherical planetoid, such as, say, like a dwarf planet in the asteroid belt, or an oblong mesh for the ocean on Kerbin, which you could then sync to the rotation of the Mun to create an effective tidal system or things like that?
You're speaking our language.
Yeah, those were things we thought about. I didn't get a chance to touch on it really in the slides, but the decal system is something we use to sort of like create, like BOP is a very oblong shaped planet, and then depending on the scale of them. So for planetary bodies, just like naturally, they're generally not going to be oblong, but as we get smaller, we can either use the new terrain system that I mentioned about, or we have plans to create a additional one for smaller non-celestial bodies. So like asteroids, those type things is something where we would want that level of control so the artist can just like tweak it, tune it. It's not meant to be a sphere. So we'll probably end up doing a different approach for that one. We probably won't end up using PQS or the concurrent binary tree system that we plan to use for the new one. But
At the extreme end of the scale, you got stuff like the Onimura, thing or something like that, just this long cigar-shaped.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, but that would be cool for tidal waves, but it's very hard for the local space to get like that height data for, that would be a whole new can of worms.
We've actually, we've gotten some crazy shapes, but also like things kind of break down because it's so extreme.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just thought I'd ask. Thank you.
Stay tuned for our future star systems.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Looking forward to losing another couple thousand hours of sleep on this one. I had a question regarding your the textures you're using for your biomes. Did you experiment with other projection methods? Because with the projection that you're using there, you effectively get incredibly high resolution wasted at the polar caps, and then get very low resolution in the middle of the planet.
Oh, so the UV distribution that we're using? Yeah, that was also partially like an artifact of the way we do scaled space to local, and we had to match the UV unwrap of whatever the sphere that we used to the planet, and also a holdover from KSP1, since we were sort of matching that and trying to recreate / build off that old system, that it was just like an artifact of that. We fixed at least like the major issues, like the ones that caused the mohole, but but unfortunately, that's one we just haven't, or I don't think we intend to do like a revamp of, although it might be something that we can handle with the new terrain system. Yeah, absolutely.
Remains to be seen, hopefully.
Yeah, but right now we're using triplanar mapping. And while that is useful for mostly every planet, certain planets definitely don't need it. So that's definitely something we could reevaluate as like our, distribution for the UVs. And I think we're going to reevaluate on a per planet basis as we go forward.
Yeah. Additionally, it looked like you were using just like basically 1 or 0 or 255 0 on the channels of your biome map. Do you use the intermediate values for anything? Like what would 127 mean?
Yeah, like depending. So like Kerbin's an example where like a lot of the biomes have pretty like discrete. Like most of the area is gonna be one biome, but for a lot of planets I think we definitely mix. So like you'll have like I know on the Mun there are areas that, or maybe what's a better example? Lathe. Yeah, Lathe like has like mixes of biomes so that you can have like some of the large scale height maps for two biomes coming together, and that can create some cool emergent terrain that it's like, oh, it's kind of a mix of the two. And yeah, we definitely use that to our advantage there.
I was just to follow up, the artist also, like, Lath's a good example, I think, because there's like little pools that also go down towards the water, but then you'll get little pools of like metal and rock, and that alternate back and forth. And since each biome can have 4 textures in it, sometimes they'll match the textures of one biome to the textures of another one, so you won't even like notice that we're doing that blend between them, so that like those harsh edges on like the biome mask can sort of get masked by the artist.
Thank you. I think this is probably going to be the last question and the last person in line.
Hey, how do you guys do the atmospheric scattering? And for the interface with the artists, do you rely more closely to like how like atmospheric scientists like model like with scale height and you know the scattering coefficients, or do you change it to something where it's like more tunable, like, oh, this is going to turn more blue or so on?
Yeah, so a little bit of both. So we modeled our atmosphere based off, I wish I could remember the name of the paper, but it was just an academic paper just based purely on how real life light bounce and scattering work. And then we used the traditional, I say traditional, but like most lighting papers on atmosphere that go over Rayleigh scattering and the different types of back scattering in order to create at least somewhat physically accurate. And then we add tuning parameters for the colors on it. So like if like sort of like what John was mentioning, that we do light overrides on planets, we do light overrides on the atmosphere, so they can get more of a control over it, and we're not doing pure physically based, because sometimes that just won't fit the game field that we're going for. Like when we'll go through design meetings on a planet, we'll say like, how's the read at like this time of day? And because the scattering is physically accurate, it is in a game, and the lighting can't be physically accurate because we don't have the computational power for that. So we have to make approximations, and because we have to do those approximations, it doesn't look as good as it would in real life. So yeah, we basically just do color overrides, and we bake all the scattering data to textures and sample those instead of doing like real-time atmospheric scattering, because that would be very expensive.
Yeah. And we have to break some rules, because like a planet like Joule, right, it's very green. So you're not going to get that in real world samples.
Yeah. And is the paper you guys referenced Nishita et al. Or?
That does sound familiar.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Nice
Thank you.
jacket. Space.
Space.
The place.
All right, great note to end on. Thank you guys so much for joining us.